Welcome to the Center for Jewish History. Very briefly, if anyone hasn't been here before, this is a really unique institution. We have 5 partner organizations here, each representing different aspects of Jewish culture and Jewish history. We are Leo Baeck Institute, focused on the history of German-speaking Jews, and our partner institution in the Kindertransport exhibition, and this program is the Yeshiva University Museum, which has fascinating collections that really also, like the Center for Jewish History, span the whole of Jewish culture and experience. There's also the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which has enormous archives and library collections related to the Yiddish-speaking people of Eastern Europe. And then there's the American Sephardi Federation, which does a lot of incredible programming, music, food, arts, and culture from Jewish cultures of North Africa and the Middle East. One of the things that links all these histories together, and where you can see different aspects in the different collections of the partners here, is of course migration and the experience of Jewish people who have had to move around the world fleeing persecution or poverty in different eras, different parts of the globe. That's going to be the focus of our talk tonight. But we're going to talk mostly about the present. The jumping off point is our current exhibition on the Kindertransport, which you have 2 more days to see. It's open tonight if you want to take a peek after the talk. Then I think it's coming down on Friday. Is that right, Ilona? Ilona from Yum isn't here yet, but it's a really extraordinary exhibition, and I hope that you'll take a look. And we have 3 really extraordinary panelists here tonight to help us do this kind of difficult and tricky thing of talking about the present, especially controversial issues in the present, and trying to put them in historical contexts. That's a very difficult thing to do, and I'm sure you'll believe me when I say we got some emails about this program. Some people took exception to the drawing of, connection or parallels between the experience of the persecution of German Jews and the Kindertransport and refugee and migration issues today. But I think we have 3 panelists that are extraordinarily deeply immersed in this topic and will really give it the nuance and the sort of well-informed discussion that it needs. First we're going to hear from Mark Hetfield, who has been with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, since 1989. He's currently the CEO and president since 2013. He's an attorney, and he's worked as an immigration attorney and for the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And since 2013, there's a really remarkable line from his bio on the HIAS website that he's been leading the transition of HIAS from an organization that helps refugees because they were Jewish to an organization that helps refugees because, quote, we're Jewish. He'll give us some perspective on the history of the Kindertransport and how that relates to refugee issues today. Then we're going to hear from Alex Aleinikoff, who is the director of the relatively recently founded Zolberg Institute at the New School on Migration and Mobility. He's an author and scholar in the field of migration and refugee studies, and he was also the deputy UNHCR commissioner before joining the New School, and I think also a professor at Georgetown for many years. And moderating our discussion tonight will be Deborah Amos, whose voice you may recognize from Morning Edition, All Things Considered on NPR. She's been covering refugee issues around the globe, has won many awards for her coverage, and she's also teaching a course right now at Princeton that is comparing the current approach to refugee policy in the United States and Canada. It sounds like a really fascinating course. And sort of might all wish we could take it, but she's here tonight. So thanks so much to our panelists, and we're going to hear from Mark Hetfield first.
Thanks. It's always great to be here at the Center for Jewish History because HIAS we're the oldest refugee organization in the world, not just Jewish refugee organization, but the oldest organization that was established with a mission to assist refugees. But of course, when we were established back in 1881 here in New York, there was no such thing legally in the United States as a refugee. Everybody who came here was an immigrant. So we were founded as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. The legal terminology for refugees coming into this country was established basically almost 100 years later. But it's great to be here because the Center for Jewish History houses our entire history. The history of HIAS from 1881 to 1949 is housed at YIVO here, and from 1950 to 2000 is at the American Jewish Historical Society. So, and many of the things that you see on exhibit come from our HIAS archives that tell this tremendous story. It's also meaningful because I was here in December for an event celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Kindertransport, with many survivors of the Kindertransport. They call themselves Kinder, or also we call them Kindertransportees, but these were the children who were rescued primarily by the United Kingdom, but also by Sweden and France during the late in 1939 primarily. Now, the Kindertransport is very much something, again, associated not with the United States, but with the United Kingdom, as I said. The 10,000 children, the lives of 10,000 children were saved by the Kindertransport from Nazi Germany. This is a small number of the 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered by the Nazis. But nonetheless, this was an extremely important humanitarian program because it did save the lives of 10,000 children. The shameful thing is that here in the United States, there were efforts going on to emulate the Kindertransport in the form of the Wagner-Rogers bill. And this was a bill that would have brought 20,000 children, German, Czech, and Austrian children, to the United States, but twice the number of the Kindertransport. But the Wagner-Rogers bill, in fact, died in Congress. This was the first legislation that Eleanor Roosevelt advocated for since becoming First Lady in 1933. Eleanor was careful not to get involved in lobbying for any kind of legislation, but she made an exception because she found it shameful that England, in her own words, England and Scandinavia had done their quote-unquote fair share to help Jewish refugee children, but the United States had not. But this legislation never saw the light of day. It never passed either House of Congress. It never, President Franklin Roosevelt, her husband, never said a word about the legislation. And so consequently, we did not do anything comparable to what the United Kingdom did. What is remarkable is that we do talk about the 1,000 children. So the United States did supposedly rescue 1,000 children. My organization, HIAS, had a role in this, but this was not a program. The term 1,000 children was not actually even invented until the 1980s. To talk about the 1,000 children from Germany, unaccompanied refugee children essentially, that we managed to get into the United States under the existing quota system. And this is really what we were up against. From when HIAS was established in 1881 to 1921, America essentially had an open door policy. People had to get through the immigration authorities on Ellis Island, and prior to that, when HIAS was first established in Castle Garden. But there was no requirement to get a visa before you came here. There were no nationality quotas in place. And so from 1881 to 1921, the American Jewish population grew from about 250,000 to 3 million in a very short period of time, almost entirely through immigration of refugees fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe, as well as extreme poverty in both Russia and Eastern Europe. In 1921, when America had gotten sick and tired of all the problems over there, in Europe, Congress decided to shut the door, and so the so-called Emergency Quota Act of 1921 was passed, which put severe restrictions on immigration to make America look more like it looked at the time of the 1890 census. And this was only meant to be a one-year restriction, but in fact, it was subsequently made even more restrictive, with even more restrictive quotas, and this remained in place until, these quotas remained in place until 1965, when President Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act. But it was these quotas that kept refugees out from Europe, Jewish refugees, and so out of desperation, there were strategies that were being developed to try to figure out how do we get in Jewish refugees by the Jewish community. And what was figured was the same strategy that was determined by the United Kingdom, which is, well, it's hard to sell adults. It's hard to bring adults into our country, but who can resist children? And frankly, that was the impetus behind the Kindertransport and also behind the Wagner-Rogers bill. It was just simply that it would be a softer sell to bring in refugee children rather than refugee adults. And what made the program kind of very strange and disconcerting is that the children who were brought in by the Kindertransport were not orphans for the most part at the time they were brought in. The vast majority of those children had parents, often both parents that were alive, but the parents had to make a choice. They knew that they could not get out. There was no right to flee at that time. There was no right to seek and enjoy asylum, but they felt they could bring their children to safety and get them out of Nazi Germany or Nazi-occupied Europe. So parents willingly gave up their kids and sent them to the United Kingdom, often to stay with Christian families, hopefully to be reunited one day. I have my personal involvement with the Kindertransport is one of my best friends who was here with me in December when we celebrated the 80th anniversary is Manny Baum, who is himself a Kindertransportee. I met him back about 4 years ago when at the age of 82, he took a bicycle journey with his family and with his grandchildren and children from Poland into Germany, tracing his refugee journey backwards and crossing the border of Poland and Germany on World Refugee Day. He did it to raise money for HIAS to assist the refugee children that we help in Darfur, in refugee camps. And he tells a very compelling story about how his family were deported from Una, Germany, into Poland. I mean, like many Jews in Germany, they were born in Germany, but they were of Polish ancestry. And so the Nazi government basically took away their nationality, declared them stateless, and deported them on Shabbat. It was actually, and I'll never forget this, on October 27th of 1939, and deported them, 1938, deported them to Poland. And there, amid all the chaos, the parents found a way to get to the Kindertransport organizers. And Manny will never forget the moment as a 7-year-old when his mother pushed him away into the hands of these strange adults, along with his brother Siegfried and his older sister, Ruth. And they never saw their parents again. They got to Danzig or Gdansk, and were getting on what was to be the last Kindertransport boat, the Warszawa. And as they were boarding, they refused to let his sister board because they said she was 14 and was therefore too old for that Kindertransport. So she was rejected from the boat. She was reunited with her parents, and all three of them perished in Auschwitz. But Manny and Siegfried managed to get to England, and Manny said that it took him 40 years to forgive his mother for what she did to him. Although what she did to him was she saved his life. But this is something that he couldn't even talk about for 40 years. He couldn't talk about his experience, and nor could his brother, until he had grandchildren and finally decided he had to come to terms with it and had to speak out on it. So that's what he has spent the rest of his life doing. And so I'll end on the note that Manny continues at the age of 86 now. He continues to bicycle all the time, and he and I belong to a bicycle group that goes to different places in the United States, but we also went to Cuba a few years ago to bicycle around Cuba. And what really struck me about Manny, that even though he was so angry at his parents for so many decades, for having basically separated from him, but saving his life in the process, whenever he met anybody from the UK, usually younger people, he would always say to them, I need to thank you because of what your country did for me. Your country did a really good thing. They saved my life and my brother's life, and I'll always be grateful for that, and you should know that your country did that for people. And it struck me because we're also conflicted about the whole concept behind the Kindertransport of separating children from their parents. But at the end of the day, it was one of the few forms of rescue that was going on at that time. And it saved 10,000 lives. Thank you.
So I'll talk about current U.S. policies, and I'll let you all think about whether or not there are appropriate parallels to be drawn or not to be drawn. I think at the most abstract level, there are some parallels worth thinking about, and that our current regime, our current set of policies, look a lot like the policies Mark described pre-war, in terms of a hesitancy or unwillingness, a deterrence of people coming to the United States in need of asylum, in need of rescue. And that the lessons that we learned in the run-up to World War II and after World War II and through the Holocaust and through the denial of refugee status to people was the need for an international regime that protected refugees. That's what was created after World War II with the adoption of a convention on refugees in 1951 and the creation of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Office in 1950. And Mark was referring to the passage of the U.S. Refugee Act in 1980, which brought our laws into conformance with these international international standards. So we sort of thought we had solved this problem, right? We knew that there were horrors committed not only in Germany, but in terms of the countries unwilling to take people in. And we had created then an international system that would rescue people and provide them safety when they needed it. And the United States led that system. We didn't do so well in the 30s, but we led the system after the 50s. The United States took more refugees for resettlement than all the rest of the world combined for many years. We created an asylum system that fairly adjudicated claims of people coming to the country. And the U.S. now gives more than $1 billion a year to the High Commissioner for Refugees office, more than any other country in the world. So we were a leader on refugee protection. We've lost that leadership. We are now, in all these ways, we've lost the leadership. So let me spend a few minutes in describing this set of policies, which is, it's not a happy story, but I'll run through some of them to try to give a sense of where we are and what needs to be done. So refugees come to the United States in two different ways. They either come through the Overseas Refugee Program, meaning that they're selected from what we call countries of first asylum. A country has a problem, people flee next door, and South Sudanese go to Ethiopia, Somalis go to Kenya, Bhutanese go to Nepal, Syrians go to Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq. And then the U.S. takes from those countries a certain number of people through resettlement. HIAS, Mark's organization, is one of the leading organizations in the U.S. to help in that resettlement process. People are identified overseas, they're brought in with the help of HIAS and some other organizations, and then they're resettled all around the country. It's actually a wonderful program because it brings refugees to communities all over the United States. What, there are 300 or 400 local groups that work with the national organizations, right, to resettle. Used to be.
Fewer than that now.
Fewer than that now, we'll say why. But there were literally hundreds, and many communities welcomed refugees in through this process. In the final year of President Obama's presidency, the goal was to reach 110,000 resettled refugees, which would have been a high number. In previous years, the numbers had been 60, 70, 80,000. President Trump came in and immediately, as part of his so-called Muslim ban, put the refugee process on hold, simply suspended it for 6 months. There were court cases. After a number of court cases, then we reached a new fiscal year, and every year this number is set for another year by the president. He kept reducing and reducing, and this year, the number set for refugee admissions is 30,000. It's down by 70% from what Obama had said. Now, this is at a time when the number of displaced people in the world is at an all-time high. Our numbers have gone down. This is a program that works. It's not particularly expensive for the United States, and as Mark said, the Kindertransport saved 10,000 lives. This saves tens of thousands of lives every year, taking people out of refugee camps, difficult situations, brings them here, starts them a new life with community support. We've gone from 110 to 30,000. It's a shame. It's more than a shame. It's something that needs to be corrected. And as I said, so on the refugee side, we've lost our leadership on refugee resettlement. Canada resettles more. A country 1/10 the size of the United States resettles more refugees than the United States does. Turkey has more refugees than any country, not through resettlement, but simply because people fled there from Syria. More than 3 million refugees. The city of Istanbul has 500,000 Syrian refugees that it takes care of. The United States this year will take 30,000 refugees, and what, less than several hundred Syrians, right? Mark,
67.
67 Syrians of more than 5 million Syrian refugees around the world. So this has been a dramatic cut in our refugee program. The second way that people come to the United States and become a refugee or an asylee is by appearing at the border or being in the United States and requesting political asylum. We call these folks asylum seekers. If they're granted asylum, we say they're asylees, as opposed to the refugees who come from overseas through the resettlement program. But the standard is the same that's applied. It's the standard from the 1951 Convention and adopted through our law. But these are two different routes in. The number of people seeking asylum every year is not set. There's no numerical limitation on that. The law says anyone who is in the country can apply for asylum. President Trump made very clear from the beginning of his presidency he was not happy with the number of people coming to the border and seeking asylum. And as part of his desire to basically close the southwest border to undocumented migrants, he said, we want to deter and deflect all people arriving at our southwest border. The problem with that is that many of these people have valid asylum claims. And so when you adopt a set of policies that tries to keep all these people out, you are leaving people in a very dangerous situation, making it difficult for them to attain asylum. Now, we can have a long talk about, well, can't they get safety in Mexico? And there's a lot to be said about that. But the basic policy the Trump administration said was no more undocumented migration, and we've got a real problem with the asylum seekers. Here's how the problem arose. In the earlier days, 10, 20, 30 years ago, the vast majority of people who showed up at the southwest border were Mexican migrants coming to work in the United States. 90% of the flow were Mexican migrants. And if they were arrested at the border, they simply accepted return to Mexico and they tried to come back again. And as the border has gotten tighter and tighter and more enforcement, that's become more difficult to do. But that was the flow 20 years ago when more than 1 million apprehensions were made at the southwest border, overwhelmingly a Mexican flow. The flow is different now. What we have now, the majority of people coming are family units coming from what we call the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala. And these are the most dangerous countries in the world in terms of per capita deaths. These are countries that have gangs that control large parts of cities and countrysides, governments that are not functioning well, and on top of that, both an economic system that's not faring well, and climate change is now having an impact on people not being able to farm and coming. So all these are contributing to people coming to the southwest border. From the Trump administration's perspective, these were all undocumented immigrants. Very few of them are entitled to asylum, so basically they are trying to game the system. And the way they thought the system was being gamed was that if someone came, as I said, the Mexicans would accept return and go home. But when someone comes from one of these countries, they seek protection in the United States, so they request asylum. And under our law, they can't be summarily returned. They have to get an asylum hearing if they meet a low standard of showing that they're likely to fear persecution if they're returned home. So people would come in, request asylum, be put in an asylum case, and because of now a massive backlog in the asylum system, they may take 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years to have their case adjudicated. Some of them would be detained, but there are limits on detaining children, and families couldn't be detained for very long because of too many people and it's too expensive to do. So people were being released from detention. And that's what the Trump administration uses this, I think, this pejorative phrase of catch and release, that people were stopped at the border, they asked for asylum, they were put in detention but couldn't be held, and they were released into the country. And so Trump saw this as a way to get basically a legal entry into the country, and then the claim was the people didn't show up for their hearings, they disappeared, and it was just the asylum process was being abused by essentially economic migrants. That was the viewpoint of the Trump government. So what they've done is adopt a huge range of policies. Almost, it feels like one a month, a new one every month, in an attempt to deflect and deter people from coming. You're well aware of some of these, and I'll just briefly mention them. First of all, he sent the military to the border to help the Border Patrol, even though under U.S. law, the military is not allowed to help out on civil enforcement of the law. Secondly, he sought to detain people for longer periods of time. That has been stopped in the courts and currently fighting about detention policy. Thirdly, he said, if you come to the United States border between a port of entry, between an official boarding place, you can no longer get asylum. You have to go to a place where you can legally enter and ask for asylum there, but we're going to stop you there and make you wait in Mexico before you can ask for asylum. That policy has been stopped in the courts as well, because our law says no matter where you are in the United States, you can ask for asylum. So a lot of these policies have actually been stopped in the courts, but these were the attempts. Then for the people who were told to wait in Mexico, the so-called Remain in Mexico policy, they're over the border, but the Border Patrol is only taking very few cases a day, or sometimes none at all. They call this process metering, where people are given a number and they can come present their case. But meanwhile, people are waiting weeks, maybe months, in cities across the border, or they're trying now to enter illegally, right, to get through the system and not be apprehended. And then, if that wasn't enough, they said, even if you get through and you're in the asylum process, we want to change the standards for asylum to make it harder to get asylum, the substantive standards. This comes up this way. So over a number of years, cases brought by asylum advocates in the U.S., which has been this group of lawyers has done amazing work representing people at the border, bringing these cases and trying to help people who've been in detention and denied asylum and pushed back. They brought a set of cases that the courts agreed with them that people who are subject to private discrimination, private persecution, that the government is unwilling or unable to stop, can ask for asylum under certain circumstances. So the main cases this applied to, and it applied particularly to the people coming from these northern tribal countries, were victims of domestic violence. These were many, many cases. It took a long time to establish this principle, but if a woman was being beaten and abused in her home and fled to the United States, and it was demonstrated that the police in her town were unable or unwilling to take care of her, protect her from her husband, and there was no safe place to be in her country, she could get asylum in the United States. The second category were people fleeing gang violence. Now, this gang violence is oddly a product of U.S. deportation laws. There weren't gangs like there are currently in these countries, except for the massive deportation of gang members out of California and other places. They'd been gang members, and they were deported for undertaking criminal acts, sent home, and reconstituted the gangs in these countries, and they're now unable to be controlled by the government. They control large parts of cities, and they try to recruit young men into the gangs, and if the kids go to the wrong side, they're likely to be killed, or if they refuse to join either gang, they may be subject to persecution or to death or threats and stuff. So these are kids who are coming north to avoid being in the gangs. Both these kinds of cases were recognized in our immigration courts. But one of the last things that Jeff Sessions did as Attorney General was issue an opinion taking these cases from the courts, because the Attorney General actually does have supervisory authority over the immigration courts, and said no more. Basically, it's going to be very hard anymore now to make these kinds of cases. So they tried to stop people from coming, to detain them, change the standards. That also has been stopped in court. And we'll see how that works its way through the courts. And then the most notorious of all, I've saved the worst for last here, is the child separation policy that directly relates to the Kindertransport issue. But let me explain how this came up, exactly what the policy was here. It is a crime to enter the country illegally. It's a misdemeanor offense. But it was never prosecuted by U.S. attorneys who could prosecute this around the country. It was occasionally prosecuted for people who had entered illegally, been deported officially, and then came back. These re-entry cases were seen as serious offenses, and occasionally U.S. attorneys would prosecute that. But for people arriving the first time, it was never prosecuted. What Sessions announced, and again, Jeff Sessions announced this with the support of the President and the Department of Homeland Security, was the so-called zero tolerance policy. And what this meant was that anybody who entered illegally would now be criminally prosecuted for illegal entry, which is like criminally prosecuting everybody who's going 5 miles over the speed limit, in the sense of the numbers are tremendous. You can't do this. Why not put people in a civil proceeding and deport them rather than tie up the criminal courts with these many people? What it allowed, the reason they did it was it allowed the government then to separate the kids. Why? Because once someone is arrested for a criminal offense and put in criminal detention, you can't keep the kid in jail with the parent, so the kid had to be separated. And it was originally described as, oh, well, this is just a consequence of the zero tolerance policy. But it became very clear that this was the purpose of the zero tolerance policy, was to separate the kids. So it would act as a deterrent, because the parents would know if they got to the country, they'd be arrested, put in a criminal proceeding, their kid would be taken from them. Several thousand children were separated. And you all know the story. You read the papers. There was a real outcry, and eventually Trump reversed the policy after a court had said it was unconstitutional to do this. And then what had happened was a number of the parents had been deported or had accepted return to their home country, being told they'd be reunited with the kids, but they couldn't make the connection because the government hadn't been ready to keep records about who was related to whom. So there were kids in the country, they couldn't find the parents. The ACLU went to court and said to the court, tell the government to find these parents. The government said, oh wait, they're your clients, you go find them. The court rejected that. So the government was under a duty to try to bring these families back together, and now under an order to let them come back in the country to pursue their asylum claims again if they gave up on their asylum claim too quickly because they thought that was the only way to be reunited with their kids. We still have, several hundred children, I think, are still in detention because their parents have not been located. This was beyond the pale. This was something that the American public just said no more. These other policies that have been done one at a time, little by little, have so undermined the asylum policy, but for the fact the courts have stopped us, that it really, if you combine this with what I've said about the refugee program, we've lost our political asylum system in this country. What once had been a model for the world is no longer. And that's why I started out by saying that we are back to the situation really of looking a lot like the 1930s when we thought, as I said, that we had won this battle, established a pretty good asylum system. But it is in need of huge repair at this point, both on the refugee side and bringing back the asylum system to where it should be functioning fairly. Now, lots of questions we can talk about in the question and answer period about, well, what do we do? The numbers are very large at the southwest border. That is true. There are numbers like we haven't seen in 10 years of people coming. It's a different flow, as I've said. So something has to be done. The set of policies have to be adopted, and as I said, we can talk about that a bit later, but I wanted to kind of bring you up to date on where we are currently in this country on asylum and refugees. Thanks.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions because I get to, and then I'm going to open it to the audience for questions. So where I want to start is what strikes me that is similar between the Kindertransport and today is some sense of public opinion. Eleanor Roosevelt was behind a Kindertransport coming to the United States. It had support in the Senate, and yet it was allowed to die because there was a public backlash, which, the 21 law was passed, the 24 law was passed. That was the feeling in the country, that people wanted the door closed. In some ways, we are back there again. There is part of the reason that the president can do what he's doing is because he has support of his base. If you look at softer numbers, there is support for migration in this country, but it's a quiet support, and there's certainly no lobby around it. So my question is this just a cycle that happens in this country, and we are in an anti-migration period, or is there something that politicians do in the 20s and now that brings these nativist feelings to the fore and can use them politically, and is there a way to combat that?
Well, those aren't really mutually exclusive, right? I think that it's really both. And you look at this exhibit, which is a terrific exhibit, the Jews and immigration in the face of American reaction, and you look at those cartoons from the 1920s, and they could have appeared last week. really. And you see the same in terms of the cartoons that are displayed in the new exhibit in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, in the new exhibit Americans in the Holocaust, where this is something where it's just the groups change, the groups that are targeted as being the bad immigrants, which is always the newest immigrants who are arriving, but it's definitely cyclical. And in terms of public opinion, what's really interesting is from the very beginning of polling in the 1930s, there was a Gallup poll which showed that 2/3 of Americans were opposed to the Wagner-Rogers bill. 2/3 of Americans polled opposed bringing 20,000 refugee children to the United States. And when you look at subsequent polls, up until the Syrian crisis, that number is consistent. That when you look at, there were polls taken in 1956 with regard to Hungarian refugees. 2/3 of Americans opposed bringing Hungarian refugees here in 1956. The numbers in 1980 for Indo-Chinese refugees, it was also 2/3 were opposed. And the polls that were taken in 2015, when the Syrian refugee crisis finally caught the world's attention, was also 2/3 against. The only time that I had seen that number reversed was in 1999 with the Kosovar refugee crisis, when 2/3 of Americans supported bringing Kosovar refugees here and only 1/3 opposed it. But it's remarkably consistent that no matter who the refugees are, 2/3 of Americans are opposed to bringing them here. But it takes political courage to do that anyway. And that's what we see in these moments when America brings in many refugees. It was not because Americans were clamoring to bring in refugees. It's because there were some courageous acts by our leaders, such as what the Carter administration showed in 1980. When in 1980, President Carter allowed in 216,000 refugees, more than any other president in any single year in history. And this was because, this wasn't because, Walter Mondale, as vice president, went to Geneva at a conference that was going on there for the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis, and he said that 40 years earlier, on Lake Evian, just down the lake in Evian, the international community got together and failed the test of humanity by doing nothing to rescue Jewish refugees. He said, we cannot fail that test again. He said, if we fail to protect Indo-Chinese refugees, history will not forgive us. If we protect them, history will not forget us. And I understand it was that speech that really rallied the international community to intervening in the refugee crisis. But it wasn't that popular opinion in this country or anywhere else was clamoring for it. And the last thing I'll say on this is, to me, HIAS as a refugee agency was so frustrated during the Syrian refugee crisis and during the escalation of the global refugee crisis, frankly, during the Obama administration, because from 2011 to 2015, you saw the number of refugees soaring. And for the United States, it was just, and for countries around the world, it was just business as usual in terms of our approach to dealing with these refugee crises. And then finally, in September of 2015, a single photograph of Elan Kurdi, a 3-year-old Syrian refugee boy, and his lifeless body photographed on the beach woke everybody up, including the Obama administration. And finally, the entire world was starting to do something about this global refugee crisis. But then that ended in November of 2015. It was a very short period of positive activity for refugees, because what happened in November, on November 13th of 2015, were terrorist attacks in Paris, where the reaction in this country was 31 governors saying, we have to ban Syrian Muslim refugees we're going to ban Syrian Muslim refugees from our states. 31 governors actually came out in the course of a number of days after those attacks and made that declaration that they were going to bar people from their states based on where those people were born or what their religion was. And then you had 14 presidential candidates. All of the Republican presidential candidates running for the primary at that time said the same thing, basically echoing the words of the governors. And this was them knowing that 2/3 of Americans are not happy about bringing refugees to the United States. And rather than demonstrating moral courage, they decided to exploit fear for political gain. And we have not yet recovered from that.
So I want to agree and disagree with Mark and then fight the question. I'll try to do that quickly. Just a small, well, it's a big point, but I'll say it quickly. So to say the world didn't respond has this, sort of Western perspective to it, because 85% of the world's refugees are in the global South. The African countries don't close their borders to refugees. The 5 million Syrian refugees were able to find safety outside of Syria. It's the resettlement countries that have closed their borders. It's when people started coming to Europe, then Europe put up the walls, and Trump has tried to put up his wall. But there's a huge tradition of hospitality in other parts of the world where most of the world's refugees are. So the second point is that, some of the people many of us who support refugees and asylees in this country say the policies of the Trump administration that's not who we are, right? And we point to our tradition of welcoming people. Here's where I agree with Mark. It is who we are. We've always had both parts of this in us. We've always had these two threads going through American history of being a nation of immigrants and a nation that doesn't welcome immigrants. And the groups, just as Mark said it to me, the groups have changed. We can go through it historical period by historical period. You know most of this already. But it's always a fight. It's always a political fight in every era about being a welcoming country or not. And we've never won that battle fully. And then here's where I fight the question. So Mark is talking about polls about accepting resettled refugees. And these are people who are already secure and safe in another country. Should we bring them in? And the fight is, well, why can't they be taken care of? Why do we need to take Syrians from Lebanon when they're already safe in Lebanon, predominantly? That wasn't true in Evian, I understand, in that other time, but now it is. But on what I find remarkable and a good sign, and something we shouldn't lose sight of, is that a majority of the American people, a significant majority of the American people disagree with virtually every position Trump has taken on immigration. They certainly disagree with child separation. They disagree with the wall. Both houses of Congress disagree with the wall, right? They disagree with the cuts in refugees. They disagree with what's happening with asylum around it. They disagree with Trump's proposal to cut legal immigration. So it's true he plays to his base because that's how he's going to get renominated, but that's probably only 35, maybe 40% of the American public. Now, it's true that the other 55-60% are not out there rallying, although we were rallying at the airports when he announced the Muslim ban. And except for one vote on the Supreme Court would have set that aside as the religious discrimination that, in fact, it was. So we kind of get overwhelmed by the tweets and think that stands for who we are. It's not. It's not where the American people are. And it showed in the 2018 election where, remember that election? Trump was out there talking about the caravan, right? Caravan, caravan, caravan. That's all he talked about in the run-up to the 2018 election. The Democrats didn't say a word about immigration. The word went out from Schumer and Pelosi. Don't talk about immigration. They talked about health care. They talked about tax cuts. And the blue wave did come in. The Democrats took the House by a large number that was more than most people would have predicted. It shows that the Trump message on immigration is not a winning message, and it's not the majority message. And I think that's what we need to say at every moment, that this is contentious. There've always been two sides, but the pro-immigration side here actually is the majority and should dominate if people can get out and politically mobilize.
So let me follow that up then. You said it's 30. I'm sorry, it's 30,000 this year as refugees. In some ways, the refugee program has now been overwhelmed by the asylum issue, that we really don't talk about it much. It's not really even 30,000. It's probably will be half of that, 15. And my guess is they'll zero out the program by the end of this administration because there's not a lobby. So how do you take, and I agree with you on the figures, there is absolutely ample evidence that says Americans are pro-refugee and pro-migration. There was a piece in the New York Times about towns in upstate New York advertising for refugees, begging for them to come, because they revitalize towns that are losing populations. And it's been shown that they start businesses even faster than native-born Americans. So how is it that this program gets rebuilt? Who is the lobby, and why are they so quiet?
Okay, so the problem on the refugee number is it's a number set by the president, by himself. If it had to be approved every year by Congress, it wouldn't be approved. So the answer to that is an election changes that. These numbers are very easy to go back up, and the American people will change that policy. They're not going to lobby Congress to change it because it's not a number set by Congress. They're going to change it if President Trump is defeated for re-election. The number will go way back up immediately.
But is it so easy, Mark? I'm sure that your institution has had to fire people because the budgets have changed, and every single one of the voluntary agencies has lost staff.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lobby, but the lobby are faith groups, right? There's no business interest group promoting it, but certainly the Catholic Church, the Jewish community, the Lutherans. I mean, every faith community is a strong lobbyist for refugees. But it's what Alex said, which is when President Trump was elected as a refugee organization, we were terrified because we knew that the easiest promise he made to keep was the promise to ban refugees or have a moratorium on refugees coming to this country. I mean, the president has the legal authority to set the annual refugee number to 0. And you could be right. I mean, I hope you're not. I think our lobby is strong enough that he will not do that, but he could set it to 0 next year. In fact, when I was except for the Christians that he wants to come in, who are not coming in either. But when I was at a UN meeting, at UN High Commissioner for Refugees this past year, there was a senior civil servant who was before a panel of hundreds of resettlement professionals from around the world during their annual consultations on refugee resettlement. And somebody from another country asked her, what do you predict the number will be for the number of refugees resettled to the United States next year? And her answer terrified me. She said, I have no idea. It will be somewhere between 0 and 45,000. And this is a woman who works for the State Department as a civil servant in a senior position. So yes, it could be 0, but you're absolutely right. In the meantime, they are dismantling an infrastructure that we have built up over the last 40 years to welcome refugees to this country. And like we were told last year, that right now there are 9 national agencies like HIAS, all of us nonprofits, 6 of us faith-based. We were told, it was almost like a game of Survivor. We were told, some of you, we're not going to tell you how many, will not be standing in a few months. And that turned out to not happen. They decided not to eliminate any of those partnerships last year. But then they told us, okay, we're not going to close you yet, but you need to close 35 sites, and you need to determine amongst yourselves which 35 sites around the country that should be. That's a very significant number. And then this year we're told to brace ourselves because once again they will eliminate entire communities from the refugee resettlement program. And these are networks again that have been built up over decades with substantial private investment of volunteers and of privately raised funds. And so it's going to take a long time to build that back up.
Pardon?
Do you want to say? I just wanted to add one more story, unless
Okay,
you have
go
another
ahead.
question you want to get to.
Well, here's my question. It'll be my last one, and then I'll open it up. And that is, I take my students to Canada, and the Canadians call asylum seekers refugees. It confuses my students because they don't really know the 1951 convention as well as I hope they would, but they've just read it for the first time. And I wondered if you thought that that actually is a smart thing to do. That if we call those people who are coming across the border, not asylees, but we call them refugees because it's all within the same 1951 convention, that people would have a different idea. Because, Alex, you're right, it's not Mexican people who are coming for jobs. This is a different community that's coming across the border. And if we called them refugees, would it make a difference?
Who's the we in that question?
People who, journalists, people who write about it.
Okay, so you're on NPR. Do you call them refugees? And could you start calling them refugees?
I could make the case.
Okay, good. I'm not disagreeing with you.
But do you think it would make a difference? That the terminology is off-putting?
I wonder whether, my real fear here is that we've lost the positive valence on the word refugee. It used to be a totally bipartisan issue, at least in the more recent years. Republicans and Democrats were happy to support refugee programs, but it may be that Trump has put such a tarnish on that word that it might not be the winning word now. I would put this to the assembled group here about whether or not that's the right word, but I'll go with any word that the public wants to rally around.
I would go with not using the word invaders, for starters. And in Israel, where HIAS also works, we have the same issue where the name they use for asylum seekers is infiltrators. And here they use the term invaders, they being Robert Bowers, who shot up the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and President Trump on a regular basis. Both use that term. But I would say that we can't associate this issue too much with Trump, because really, again, when you look back to the 31 governors and the 14 presidential candidates, Trump only outdid them. But he was riding a tide that a lot of politicians were riding at that time.
Alex, did you have one more story you said?
Well, just a little story was the Trump argument on why we should take fewer refugees is that it's more expensive to take care of them in the U.S. than in Kenya or wherever else people are being cared for, which is true. And so because we offer people benefits for a year and we make sure that they're integrated and et cetera. The White House, probably Stephen Miller, asked the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Refugee Resettlement inside the Health and Human Services Department, to do a study to demonstrate the cost of taking care of a refugee in the United States versus the cost of taking care of a refugee overseas. Well, HHS, Mark mentioned another civil servant, being good civil servants, did a study, and they said, but wait a second, shouldn't we also be thinking about the benefits that refugees bring, not just the cost? So they produced a report that said, yes, it's more expensive to take care of someone here than overseas, but net for the United States, in the long run, refugees are a economic benefit to the United States. And they played out their work history and taxes they paid and whatever, and they showed that refugees actually are good for the United States. Well, that's not what the White House asked for, obviously, and so the paper got to the White House and it was buried, and it's only because it was eventually leaked out of the State Department that we ever found out about it, but it was never finalized and never released by the White House.
I'd like to open it up to questions. Can you just state your name and make your question kind of short, if you don't mind?
And if we could just get people to please use the mic for your questions so that we can hear it on the recording.
Okay, name is David Klappholz. I've got sort of a personal question. Well, it's a very personal question. My mother was on a Kindertransport with two of her younger sisters. 10 or 12 years ago, I found a Kindertransport organization in the UK that had an archive of material about people who came. I was told when I emailed them that they had no record of my mother having come, but they had records of her two younger sisters. The only way we could explain that, because we knew my mother came, she didn't lie about it, was that she was 18 years old or so, which was too old to be on a Kindertransport, but they let her go with her sisters because neither of her parents was, neither one was in Berlin. Her mother had died, her father had been deported to Poland, so she was taking care of her two sisters in Berlin at that time. So there was no way that I could get the records of my two aunts coming on the Kindertransport from Berlin to the UK, to Southampton, I think it was. They told me that if I had one of my first cousins ask for their mother's report, they could have sent it. But neither of them was interested enough in following up on it. I tried going back a year or 2 or 3 ago, and the organization no longer seems to exist, at least not online. If I want to get information about my mother and his 2 sisters, which Kindertransport they came on, why my mother was allowed to go, I think we know the reason, but it's not certain, and whatever other details I have, is there any organization that has an archive where I can find this information?
Yeah. I would contact the Association of Jewish Refugees, the AJR, in the United Kingdom. They actually took over what was the equivalent of the Kindertransport Association, took over their work. So yeah, and I just attended their Kindertransport conference in London 2 months ago on their celebration of the 80th anniversary. Okay. So yes.
This lady in the back.
My name is Evelyn Frankfurt. First, in terms of the commonality between the refugee Jews and today, there was a very right-wing book that was published in '41, I believe, saying that there were 200,000 Jews massed on the Mexican border, ready to invade and rape American women. So the parallel is completely there. And anybody who would think it isn't, really is smoking something. In any case, the question is, there's a sanctuary movement afoot too in this country, and synagogues and churches are sponsoring families and keeping them, fed and clothed and housed. To what degree, is that too small and infinitesimal an effort, or is that something that can have an impact?
I mean, the sanctuary movement in the 1980s had a huge impact, and I think ultimately led to the reform of was contributed to the reform of our asylum laws, or not our asylum laws, but our asylum policies. Because at that time, and it was also Central Americans, the asylum system, in spite of the beauty of the Refugee Act of 1980, was highly politicized. So if you were an asylum seeker from El Salvador, or Honduras, or Guatemala, you had almost no chance of getting asylum. If you were an asylum seeker from Nicaragua, you had a very good chance of getting asylum back during the Reagan administration. But frankly, that's changed, right? The asylum system was reformed as a result of the sanctuary movement and also a lawsuit that was somewhat associated with it. To make the asylum determinations much more objective. So at this point, a sanctuary movement in the sense of protecting asylum seekers from removal probably won't be as beneficial because frankly, we have an asylum system that is still not coming out with bad determinations. But you can see that the efforts that Attorney General Sessions made has started the process of reversing that and making it more difficult for Central Americans to get asylum. So that time may come soon when a sanctuary movement may be necessary again.
Yeah, just a couple of points. There is a group in New York called the New Sanctuary Coalition, and they work on not just asylum, but across the board. They're against deportations in general, and so they accompany people to hearings and the like, and that's an active movement in the United States. In New York, it's much less of taking people into churches and synagogues where the sanctuary movement began, as Mark described, and more helping people through this difficult time. But let me mention one other possibility here that I think is a more realistic possibility and could build into a political movement, and this is something that Canada does, which is called private sponsorship, where groups of individuals say they will bring in refugees and take care of them and sponsor them and be responsible for the financial side of this. And this is something even this administration should be willing to think about because it doesn't cost the government anything. The Canadian model is now being taken to other countries around the world, and there are some countries that are beginning to think about a large private resettlement program. One of the problems is if a government moves to that and cuts back on its own resettlement program, which made some people worry about introducing that in the United States. Since our program's already been basically cut down to almost nothing, I think now it's time to have a political movement that would actually push for private resettlement. And imagine if you went up online on a website or said, how many groups of 5 people would be willing to take a refugee, and you'd have 1 million Americans sign up on that in a few weeks. And I think that could be a basis for organizing the kind of lobby that Deb was talking about on behalf of refugee resettlement, or actually may produce a private resettlement program that in another administration could help advance the number of people who are resettled. And it'd be a great way for Americans to show, because Mark and I are in these panels a lot, and not always together, but often, and the question usually people come up with is like, what can I do? Right? What can I do about this? And I never have a terrific answer about it. This is something we can all do together, is to lobby for something like this. Yeah.
But also, Americans actually give money to those Canadian groups.
Yes.
Because you can do it online, and they did it a lot. That's where the lobby is. It's just a matter of organizing them. The lady right there with the glasses.
I'm sorry. I'm Judy, and I have a question and a comment for Mark about the sad story about his friend and his brother who were young refugees, but I'm confused about the older sister being denied a place on the train because she was 14, unless that was arbitrary and capricious action by some worker. Because my mother was a Kindertransport refugee from Prague to London, and she was 17, and my dad raised some question after she died, but never any proof that maybe she was actually 18 and her paperwork had been falsified, which would be completely understandable. But why a 14-year-old had that fate?
Yeah, I think they were just looking at, I think all the seats on the boat had been taken, and they were trying to find a way to, eliminate passengers because they were oversubscribed, and so they made the cutoff. But you're right, there were Kindertransportees that were certainly older than 14 on other boats.
Thank you very much. So we referenced the Trump base as the basis of many of Mr. Trump's policies, as misguided as they are. Has anyone studied the Trump base? And in the context of the refugees and asylum seekers, what can we do, or what, as a country of liberals, can we do to change the opinion of the Trump base with regard to refugees? For example, significantly emphasizing the economic benefits. For example, emphasizing the hard work and American values. I'll share one thing and then let you go. I'm a physician at the Veterans Hospital in Brooklyn. About 50% of the veterans that I see are from the Caribbean, South America, Russia, China. They're not Americans. And they're really part of our armed forces. They've served, and they're as American as any American who was born here. Look forward to your statements.
Well, so I think the economic arguments don't work. They seem not to move anybody, because it's been said for a long time that immigration as a whole, even undocumented immigration, is a net benefit to the country, and that doesn't seem to work. I think what Mark pointed to earlier about working with faith-based groups is the most important. I've seen some recent videos now that people are putting together. There's a real campaign going on about this, and they've started with a set of videos with faith-based groups who've taken in refugees, and they talk about how their support for refugees comes from their faith and what it has meant to them to do so. So I think actually, in terms of if you're going to, my point of view is you don't need to change the Trump voters because we have enough on the outside to actually win. But if you want to change them, that probably is going to be the most effective, as well as just the experience of having refugees in the community. This is really the horrible part of this. One of the really bad part of the cuts in refugees here is that organizations like Mark, they're sending fewer people to the field, to these communities where people met these people face to face and got to know them. But I think it's the human contact and the stories, not the data, that makes the difference.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a really good question, and that's the question that we struggle with more than any other, and I don't have a good answer for it. I can tell you that I've experimented. One thing I tried was going on Tucker Carlson. That was a bad idea. And if you don't believe me, just Google me, and that's always the first thing that comes up, unfortunately. But that's the real problem, is at this time we really are all living in echo chambers. So even back in 1999 with the Kosovo crisis, I think that was just before the internet age really dawned. And at that time, we were still, yes, we were getting our news from CNN or from the 3 networks, and I think that's what really made us all feel like empathy for the Kosovo refugees, is this was a refugee crisis in real time on television with no networks trying to vilify these people. Now, I think if you had the Kosovo crisis today, you would get a very different depiction of it, and you would get one narrative if you watched MSNBC and another one if you watched Fox News. And I think that's the biggest problem that we're facing is everybody lives in an echo chamber on this and on so many other issues. And we certainly have, in the refugee advocacy community, have not figured out how to crack that nut. I totally agree with Alex that our best bet is to go through faith communities. The evangelicals are, of course, a significant part of Trump's base, but they also have a very strong pro-refugee lobby. I mean, there's no unified point of view toward refugees in the evangelical church, in evangelical churches. So we need to focus more on the pews. Likewise, I've had a few meetings with faith groups and Nancy Pelosi lobbying her on refugee issues. And it's interesting because every time we go into those meetings with the speaker, it's the same, where she instantly starts attacking the Catholics in the room and the Catholic Church, because she says, the Pope always says the right things, but I'm not hearing it when I go to Mass, and I go to Mass a lot in a lot of different churches. So Alex is absolutely right. I mean, our best hope is to try to rally faith-based groups to our cause and try to increase, personal contact rather than this fear-mongering, where you see that most people who are the most fearful of refugees are in places where there aren't any.
Can I say that I think, in some ways, the economic argument backfires? Because for a lot of that base, they don't like to hear about successful refugees because it's as if they are taking our jobs. Two, as a journalist, I have to call up people who I know are anti-refugee because I need to put them in my stories. And I called up in St. Louis the head of the Phyllis Schlafly organization. A reasonable person to put into a story, you have to have the other side. And he said, we don't care about trade. What we care about is migration, and it has to stop. And if Trump lets the DACA people in, he has betrayed us, and we will never forgive him. And I haven't forgotten that interview. And it makes me think every time Trump almost finds a solution for the DACA people, he always pulls back. And I think about that guy who runs the Phyllis Schlafly organization in St. Louis, that it would betray him. And I think that Trump knows that. Lady in the hat.
Hi, thank you. Good evening. So what if we said this? There's one creator of the universe, he's the one, and we are all someone. We are all some of the one. Just the way the sun shoots out rays and lights up the world, each and every one of us has an inner light, a mission. I can't do yours and you can't do mine, but I can help you do yours and you can help me do mine, and then we elevate and refine the world to where it's supposed to be. What do you think of that? You're talking about faith-based groups. What if we started with that? What if we started a new movement that we're all connected? Okay, and if we could do something like that, then we would eliminate all the hypocrisy, because we're all immigrants. We all came from some immigrant, and we have to fight. We can do it. You have NPR. Why isn't NPR saying more things like this? It's my favorite, but you're not saying enough. When you meet with Nancy Pelosi, tell her these things. Tell her that we need her to make a difference. We can do this. This is not rocket science, and we've got to get Trump out, yes, because he's a danger to everyone here, but we can do this. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure of the religious doctrine that was being put forth there, but let me say this. I think what you're describing is common to most of the world's religions. I think of the famous statement in the Jews know, and it's also repeated in the Quran, that if you save one life, you save the world. And I read that thought the same way, that we are all connected. That's one interpretation, at least, of that of that saying. But I don't find that a startling proposition you're putting forward, and I find it seems to be what you're saying is that all people have a certain kind of human dignity. We're all equal in how the world was created, and that seems to be a message that all religions share, as far as I know.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I would also say, in defense of NPR and the New York Times, and their coverage has actually been excellent. Deb is right that NPR always does present both sides, and they make an effort to do that. If Fox News made the same effort, I wouldn't have so many issues with Fox. If MSNBC made the same effort, I think some wouldn't have so many issues with MSNBC. But the problem is that the people that we're trying to move don't listen to NPR and don't read the New York Times. So we need to try to figure out how to reach the people that don't use NPR and New York Times as their sources for information.
Sir? Hang on, it's coming. It's coming.
Oh, there's a lot to process. I was the photographer. I mean, for the real estate industry. So I worked a lot with the president since '83, and there is no. Oh, I'm sorry. I was the photographer. I know. I've been working with the president since 1983. As the photographer, you're a fly on the wall. He's the hole in the wall, but I'm the fly on the wall. So he doesn't ever he makes believe he's going to bring it to DACA and he's going to solve it, but then he doesn't. He'll never do it. He'll never do it. I was in Arizona visiting friends who were able to buy $1 million homes, and just a couple of years ago, Tucson, and which is kind of liberal purple. And all she was talking about in the car was how the gangs come in over the border, and their job initiation is to rape women and then go back, and that's how they get ahead. And it's conflated. Everything's conflated. Anybody who comes over the border is a criminal, or they're sent. They send. What was the first thing he ever said? They're sending us their worst. And to convince people, I think that my feeling is to get to the core. If we live in a country where you can come in second and win, no matter what, I can't see this as possible anymore.
And your question?
I'm asking for a comment on it.
Okay.
And also, my question is, I would really like to hear, when you went on, don't make me watch that guy, Tucker, how did he take apart your arguments? I mean, what did he do? Because, I feel very informative. That informs. When you bring up that it's an economic benefit because these people work and they bring in and pay taxes, doesn't mean anything. That they're actually here for asylum. My grandparents came for asylum in the 1900s. Doesn't mean anything. So it's a comment to a question. Maybe I'll have some. Maybe I was informative. Maybe not. So my question is, if you can come in second in this country and win, once the voting rights have been destroyed and the gerrymandering is microsurgery, what is there to do? Question.
I think that's the conference.
Yeah, the number one rule when you go onto any television show is the host always wins. And in this case, what he challenged was my assertion that it's an American value to welcome refugees, which he found outrageous. And again, this is because refugees are conflated with terror and crime in the depiction that Fox News makes.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Ben. I have a question. I am interested in the relative, we're here at a place where we celebrate history, or at least acknowledge it and try to be cognizant of it and what's come before us. And we talk about the Kindertransport, we talk about migration from the Northern Triangle, but there seems to me that there's a relative, or at least there's a gap in knowledge about conditions that led to something like the Holocaust versus a gap in knowledge that led to something like migration from places like Guatemala, El Salvador. And Alex, you touched on this a little bit about the history of migration from the region and what led to it, but to me, or I would argue, and I'm no political scientist, but I would argue that much of that migration came from the US-led coup in 1954 and the civil wars that followed, and then the Reagan administration doubling down on that in the 80s and what have you. And my question really is, how can we talk so much about the history of something like the Holocaust and how that informs our refugee policy today, whereas there's much less talk about hundreds of thousands of people dying in Central America, leading to the conditions that are there now, and the gangs and what have you, and the completely unstable governments. Where is that conversation? Why is it missing? Out of curiosity, not as a targeted critique of any of you. Alex, I love your podcast. Just saying in general.
That's a really good question. So let's. I'm tempted to say it's because the country doesn't want to make up for its prior wrongs, but it is interesting that after Mark mentioned that after the Vietnam War, the U.S. took in 1 million Vietnamese refugees out of a sense of obligation. So why don't we feel the same obligation towards people coming from the Northern Triangle? And I don't have a great answer, except I think it's probably the politics of the people. There's the smart book that's been written about the history of the U.S. refugee program, about that it gained its power and its story when the people who we were taking in were also fleeing people who were our political enemies, so people coming from Eastern Europe, let's say, and that it was the turning of the refugee system into a humanitarian system more than a political vehicle that has actually lessened the public support for it, because it's no longer seen in the public interest. So for Tucker Carlson, I assume that if you said we're taking people from the Soviet Union, he would understand that, or fleeing from Iran, he would understand that, because there's a political motive behind it. But once it becomes merely, quote unquote, merely humanitarian, people say, well, there are a lot of poor people around the world, and there are a lot of people, and we can't do everything, and other people aren't doing their share, and the like. So it's the humanitarianness, the argument of this book is that's what's in some ways reduced the strong support for refugee programs. Now, whether that gets to the point of explaining why we don't feel responsible for the Northern Triangle, I don't know. I think that might require a kind of soul searching in this country that we are loath to do.
Yeah, it is a really good question, and I would say that the perspective that HIAS takes as an organization, and when we look at the response of building the international refugee system out of the ashes of the Holocaust, was a human rights perspective, right? It was about everybody has the right to flee, everybody has the right to seek and enjoy asylum as a human right. We find that when you play on guilt and when you play on responsibility for displacement, that's where it gets more complicated. I mean, Americans don't want to take responsibility for the mess in Central America. Even and when you look at the cases where we have stepped up to the plate and taken refugees, we were taking people that we felt were on our side. So with the Vietnamese refugees, these are people who we felt were on our side during the Vietnam War. The argument for the Bush administration taking in many Iraqi refugees was these are people that fought alongside of us when we went into Iraq. It's the same with the special immigrant visas we're taking from Afghanistan. I mean, there's a much more positivity when it comes to helping people who are on our side than people who were displaced because of something bad that we did. So the argument for Iraqi refugees wasn't we created this mess, it was, oh, these are the people that fought alongside with us.
And it took a while.
And to take that just one step further, the numbers we see now are nothing compared to what we're going to see because of climate change, which is a problem we've created, right? So unlike situations where, should we resettle people from countries that have experienced a conflict, that's one thing. But now we're talk about responsibility here. Should we be taking people fleeing situations in their home countries that we are responsible for? Right, in terms of creating the climate change, we'll see if that wins or not in the American political debate. It hasn't so far.
I have a question.
One more.
My name is Shirley Glickman. Okay, my question is that it's very humanitarian, and I hear what everybody says. I respect everybody's opinion. How are you going to organize this? They had Ellis Island. And they had Angel Island in California when Asians came through. But here, you're having a lot of people making demands, okay, and kind of pushing it. So it's really quite overwhelming. And the numbers are how do you organize this? I mean, you could say you want to save the world, and I'm a humanitarian, okay, just like everybody else in this room. Well, how are you going to do this? And it seems that it's extremely not organized. That's one thing. And then I just want to make a statement. In this country, anybody can get an education. You walk into this country, whether you're documented or not, you will go to the Department of Education. You are entitled to an education. I'd like to ask anybody in this room, if you went to another country, could you get a job? Would you get an education? Who would take care of you? So there's just two sides of the story. It's not anti-people. How do we organize this? What do we do?
Well, first of all, on the second part of that, in many countries, you would in fact get a job and an education, and probably you'd get access to universal health care, which you can't get in this country. So I don't want to put us on a pedestal too much, okay? But all right, but the much more serious question you're asking, which is a really good question, and one that, by the way, the liberals do not ask themselves enough, is, so what should we do? What's the system we should do? We have 100,000 people in the last 2 months each coming to the border. What system should we have in place? So if the right wing is wrong to call these people invaders, the left wing is wrong to call them all refugees, because many of the people coming are not refugees in the classic sense of refugees. So you need a system in place that sorts people out appropriately, provides protection to people who need it and not protection to people who don't. So the system that, what I would do at the southwest border is, first of all, put a lot more judges at the border, hear cases more quickly, and because you want the good cases to be dealt with. You want the people to come in who need the help quickly and not wait, and certainly not be detained. But I think there needs to be a regional approach here as well. So I could imagine the UNHCR working on an approach inside Mexico that would take asylum seekers, adjudicate them, ask countries of the region to bring to not just all come to the United States, but other countries of the region to take people in. But then thirdly, the most important thing I think would be is, I think the U.S. ought to adopt an admissions program directly from the Northern Triangle, recognizing that a lot of people are coming for some for economics, some for violence, some for both. But why not have a program that says we'll take 50 or 100,000 people directly from Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, based on their kind of need or whatever connection, or if they have a job or a skill, and you won't have people arriving at the border asking for asylum at the border, because there might be an orderly process that could take care of them. So, and that's a proposal that that should receive bipartisan support. The numbers are not very large. We still give out 1 million green cards a year in this country, 1 million. So to take 50, 100,000 people from the Northern Triangle to stop this flow of spontaneous people arriving at the border, I think could go a long way towards resolving. So it needs that kind of comprehensive approach. The problem is, as I said, the right wing is they're invaders, keep them all out, and the left wing is they're all refugees, bring them all in, and it's got to be something that is more comprehensive and more nuanced than that.
Mark, last word?
Sure. It's interesting you ended on that note, Alex, because my only criticism of of the perspective you gave on the Central American situation and the migrant situation along the southern border is that you did not mention the Central American Minors Program. And this is a program that the Obama administration set up for precisely that reason, to allow Central American minors who are at risk of fleeing across the border for their lives to reunite with family in the United States, to allow them to apply for a safe and legal passage here. And one of the first things that the Trump administration did when they took office was they closed down that program, which was the only legal avenue for children with parents in the United States who were in temporary protected status to come and reunite with their parents. And so the Trump administration keeps closing down all the legal avenues to get into the United States, and then they wonder why are so many people crossing illegally.
But a court just overturned, so the people in line are going to get to come in.
Right. A court in another case brought by the International Refugee Assistance Project, IRAP, God bless them, decided that the 3,500 children who were in line should be able to proceed with their cases and come to the United States. But that's only retrospective, it's not prospective. So anybody who did not get in line will not be able to get in line.
And will come illegally.
Right, and will cross the border and risk their lives and come in as undocumented immigrants.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody.